I would like to focus some important points about the selection of motor used for various drives. The correct choice of motor is very much needed for any drive. So, due to incorrect selection of a motor, the drive becomes totally failure. I will explain the important drives used in different industries. Firstly, the crane and hoist. The cranes and hoists are used for lifting heavy masses. So, normally the cranes and hoists are used in every industry. The main function of the crane is to lift the heavy masses from one place to another place. Similarly, the hoist is also used to raise the masses using ropes and pulleys. For these cranes and hoists, the motor used should have very high starting torque. High starting torque is required for motor. Motors are robust and rated for half or 1 hour and develop 200% starting torque. The motor used for cranes should have very high starting torque. So, it is approximately 200% of starting torque is required. The motor used for crane must be very strong construction, that is robust. The rating of the motor should be selected either half an hour or 1 hour. So, normally the crane comes under intermittent duty motor, that is the load on the motor is applied in identical duty cycles, that is application of load as well as the rest period, that is the crane is operated for some time and it will be switched off, so it have the rest period. The hoist motors have electromechanical brakes applied by springs to hold the load when supply is off. The hoist motors will have the braking system. The braking system will be applied by means of springs. The main function of braking is, suppose whenever there is a failure in power supply, there is a possibility that the lifted mass may fall down. Due to the presence of these braking, the motor will hold the mass without slipping. Selection of motor. DC series motor can be employed. AC slip ring induction motor totally enclosed. So, for the purpose of crane and hoist, the motor used is of DC series motor. The DC series motor will have very high starting torque. Similarly, the series motor can be run only after applying certain amount of load on the motor. Next, the AC slip ring induction motor, that is totally enclosed. So, most of the drives will employ the induction motor. It is widely used in industries. Totally enclosed means the motor will contain an enclosure and it is designed in such a way that dust will not enter into the motor or moisture cannot enter into the motor, so that motor will be totally safe. Suppose the heating effect generated in the motor will be dissipated outside from the surface of the motor. So, normally these totally enclosed motors will have fins arranged on the surface, so that it will have the natural cooling. They are used for the cooling purpose. The diagram shown here is 11 kilowatt induction motor, which is totally enclosed motor. The next important drive is the lift. The lift is normally employed in huge buildings and in industries also. The main function of the lift is to carry the human beings from one floor to another floor. So normally for the lift, the motor used will have very high accelerating torque. So for lift, high smooth accelerating torque of 200 to 250% of full load torque at starting. So the accelerating torque used for the lift is around 200 to 250% of the starting torque, and the torque exerted will be very high and smooth. High overload capacity and pull out torque. So the motor should have high overload capacity because many people it will carry, so the motor should work with overload condition. At the same time, the pull out torque is very important for the motor. If the pull out torque is absent, there is no movement for the lift. Motors are 1 hour rated with duty cycle of 150 to 180 starts per hour. The rating of a motor is normally 1 hour duration. That is, the lift also comes under the intermittent duty. That is, the application of load for some time and the motor is rest for some more time. That is, application of load and rest period will exist for the lift motor. So normally the duty cycle or the duty factor must be considered for the lift. So we can define the duty factor. It is the ratio the on time of motor divided by the on time plus off time. It is called the duty ratio. Here for lift, the duty cycle will be 150 to 180 starts per hour. Maximum degree of silence. So while moving the lift, the motor should not give any sort of noise because the people will be traveling in the crane, so they should not feel any uncomfort. So maximum degree of silence must be required for the lift motor. Selection of motor: DC compound motor, AC slip ring induction motor. The motor used for the lift is DC compound motor. In the case of DC compound motor, we have the series winding as well as the shunt winding. Due to the presence of the series winding, the motor will have a good starting torque, and due to the presence of shunt winding, approximately constant speed can be maintained for the lift. So the DC compound motor is most widely used for the lift. Coming to the selection of AC motor, slip ring induction motor can be used for the lift. The next drive will be drilling, lathe, grinding and milling machine. The main function of the drilling machine is to punch holes on any metal sheet, whether it may be small thickness or it may be larger thickness. Similarly, the lathe machine is used for the manufacture of machine tools. And grinding and milling, the grinding means crushing the metal into small particles. It is called grinding and milling machine. So what are the important motors used for this particular drive? The drive require low starting torque and constant speed. So for drilling and lathe machine, the starting torque will be almost less, and we have to maintain the motor speed should be constant. For that purpose, DC shunt motor is most widely used for the lathe machine. We can maintain the constant speed in the case of a shunt motor. Similarly, drilling machine require different speeds for different metals. So, in the case of drilling machine motor, the speed will vary depending upon the thickness of the metal. That means the metals may be a smaller thickness and it may be larger thickness. Small thickness, the speed will be lesser is required, and for larger thickness, high speed is required for the drilling machine. So, the speed will vary depending upon the nature of the metal. Motors with pole changing winding can be used to give 4 economical speeds. So, in the case of AC motor like 3-phase induction motor, the pole changing method can be employed for getting the different speeds. Normally we get 4 economical speeds in the case of induction motor by pole changing method, which is more suitable for this grinding and milling machines. So, selection of motor is DC shunt motor, AC 3-phase squirrel cage induction motor. The DC shunt motor is most widely used because it gives approximately the constant speed, and similarly for AC supply, the squirrel cage induction motor is most widely used for this particular drive, the lathe, grinding and milling machines. Squirrel cage induction motor, the totally enclosed type, is shown in the figure. So, the outer frame is called the enclosure. Totally enclosed means we cannot see the rotor as well as the windings. The advantage of totally enclosed motor is the moisture cannot enter into the motor, as well as the dust particles will not enter. So, this totally enclosed motor is usually adopted wherever the humidity content and dust particles are very high in the atmosphere. Pump sets. So, normally we are using varieties of pump sets for domestic as well as for industrial purposes. Even in the domestic, we are having a single phase motor connected to a pump for lifting the water from a well. So, normally we are having centrifugal pumps as well as reciprocating pumps used in industries. Drip proof type, totally enclosed and surface cooled type motor can be employed. Drip proof motor, the main advantage of drip proof motor is even if you pour solid particles on the motor, or if you pour water on the motor, or moisture cannot enter into the motor. That type of motor is called drip proof type. It is normally used wherever the humidity content is very high in the atmosphere. Normally it is used in pump houses and dye houses. Similarly, totally enclosed type also can be used, and surface cooled type. The advantage of totally enclosed type is no dust particles will enter into the motor, and whatever the heat generated will be dissipated to the outside atmosphere from the surface of the motor. We cannot see any part in the motor, and normally the fins are arranged on the surface to facilitate for the cooling purpose. Motor coupled to pump. In the pump sets, we have a motor, it is coupled to a pump for lifting water for any important purposes. V-belt drive is employed. So we are having varieties of belt drive. Normally we are using flat belt drive and V-belt drive, and V-belt drive is very efficient and economical. For that V-belt drive, we have two pulleys. On the surface of the pulley, V grooves are notched and V-belt passes over the pulleys. This V-belt drive is very important because it will have a good gripping between the belt and the pulley. Starting torque is 40 to 45% of full load torque. So for pump sets we require starting torque. It is approximately, the percentage will be 40 to 45% of the full load torque if you calculate. Next drive will be, I have shown here the figure of the drip proof type of motor normally employed in the industries. That is, the moisture cannot enter and it is used in damp conditions wherever the atmosphere is full of water and moisture. Similarly, the diagram shown here is totally enclosed surface cooled 750 watts high torque induction motor. Next, selection of motor for the pumps, centrifugal pumps and reciprocating pumps. For centrifugal pumps, we are using 3-phase squirrel cage induction motor. So as the name itself indicates, centrifugal, that is, the force acts from the center. It is called a centrifugal force. It is employed in the pumps. That is, for lifting water, we are using the centrifugal pumps. Similarly, reciprocating pumps. In the case of reciprocating pumps, as the name itself indicates, you have a shaft will be moving in the motor, and reciprocating pump comes under pulsating load, that is, the constant torque superimposed by the various pulsations. So the 3-phase slip ring induction motor is most widely used for this reciprocating pumps. The next drive will be punches, presses and shears. Heavy sudden loads are applied. So the punching machine, normally the punching machine is usually employed to punch small holes for metal sheets. Even our routine use, we are using a small hand driven punching machines also. Similarly, the pressing machine, that is, a pressure can be applied over a certain surface by means of a pressing machine. And shear, the shearing machine. The shearing machine is nothing but a large cutting machine. It is in the form of a scissor. So normally for punches, presses and shears, heavy sudden loads are applied, because for punching the holes sudden load will be applied. So all these machines comes under impact load. Whenever sudden load will be applied, it is comes under impact. So DC compound motor is used, and AC slip ring induction motor is used with flywheel. So for punching, pressing and shears, DC compound motor is most widely used because it contains series winding and shunt winding. That is the most advantage. Because of series winding, the starting torque is good and almost high, and due to the presence of shunt winding we can maintain approximately constant speed. And slip ring induction motor with flywheel is employed because these machines comes under impact load. In the impact loads, sudden loads will be applied. We cannot say during some time you may get peak load, during some time you may get light load. Whenever the load is peak, the current drawn from the supply is also very high. So that is why whenever there is a peak load, we have to use higher size of cables. Whenever there is a light load, again the current drawn from the supply will be less. So that is why in the case of punches, presses and shears, AC slip ring induction motor used with flywheel, the main function of flywheel is load equalization. That is, whenever the load on the motor is light, the flywheel accelerates with high speed and it stores the entire kinetic energy, and whenever there is a peak load, the flywheel will supply the kinetic energy to the motor, so that the demand for the peak load can be maintained by means of a flywheel. It is a big wheel attached to the shaft of the motor. So the next drive will be planing machine. The importance of planing machine is, suppose for example there is a wood, just like carpentry work, the top layer can be removed. For that purpose we can use the planing machine, but in industries larger planing machines can be employed to remove the top layer for heavy size woods. The cutting stroke is slow and return stroke is quick. Heavy mass of the job, motor has to be accelerated and decelerated. So that means the speed of the motor we have to increase during cutting stroke, and during the return stroke the speed will be reduced. So that is why acceleration and deceleration will be arise frequently for the motor, and DC compound motor is most widely employed for this particular drive. So the next drive will be excavators. The importance of excavators is to dig holes and channels. Normally for civil engineering people, in the construction of buildings and dams, these excavators will be widely employed for digging the holes. The motor required should have high starting torque. So the motor used for excavators needs huge starting torque. So naturally the DC series motor is very widely employed, because that is the only motor will have very high starting torque at the beginning, and DC series motor should never be started without applying some mechanical load on it. Similarly, AC slip ring induction motor are used totally enclosed. For AC motors, the induction motor, whether it is maybe squirrel cage or slip ring, used in every industries, and it is totally enclosed. It gives some sort of protection from dust and moisture, and entire heat will be dissipated automatically. But some motors will have fan mounted to facilitate cooling purpose. So the next drive will be domestic. So for domestic purpose we are using varieties of motors. Universal series motor will be employed for domestic purpose. For example, you have mixie, sieving machine, hair dryer, vacuum cleaner. So normally all these domestic appliances needs a motor. We are using universal motor, as the name itself indicates. Universal means it will be operated on AC supply as well as DC supply. Suppose for example the mixie motor comes under short time duty motor. So short time duty motor means the motor will be operated for certain period for about a few minutes. It is rated for 15 minutes or half an hour. That is, the operating time of the motor is very short and ideal time of motor is very high. So that is why in the case of mixie motor, the motor does not reach the steady temperature because the operating time is very less, but the motor will reach the ambient temperature because off time is more, so automatically ambient temperature will reach for the mixie motor. The next drive will be breweries. So breweries means normally the manufacturing of a liquor, that is normally the beer. For manufacturing purpose we are using varieties of motor, but the moisture content is very high and the motors have to use for damp conditions. So in the case of breweries, motors have to work in damp atmosphere. Totally enclosed surface cooled type motors are preferred. Single phase AC motors are used. So in the case of breweries, any type of single phase AC motor is useful, but it is totally enclosed because lot of moisture and water particles will be in the atmosphere. There is a possibility that moisture can enter into the motor and the winding may get destroyed, and totally enclosed means it can be, dust particles can be prevented from entering into the motor. So automatically we have the surface cooled type. So whatever the heat generated can be dissipated into the atmosphere from the surface. So this type of motors are very much useful for breweries. The next drive will be wood working machine. Chances of motor being buried in sawdust. So even this woodworking machine is similar to carpentry work. While doing that work, lot of sawdust will be produced. So sometimes there is a possibility that motor may be buried in the sawdust, so that entire dust can enter into the motor and winding may get destroyed. So we have to remove the entire sawdust for this type of motors. The machine require greater than 300 rpm. So that is the minimum speed required for the motor. It should be greater than 300 rpm, then only woodworking can be done very easily. Totally enclosed surface cooled type motor used. Selection of motor: AC induction motor with frequency changer and DC commutator motor. So these two motors are widely employed because due to change in frequency we get different speeds for the motor. So for woodworking machine, the induction motor and DC commutator motor are very much widely used. The next drive will be belt conveyor. This is very important equipment used in many industries. For example, in the case of thermal power plant, you have the coal yard. The coal is transported from coal yard to the boiler house by means of this particular belt conveyor. In addition to the coal in industries, For moving sand and gravel, these belt conveyor can be employed. The gravel means the small particles of stones. So this belt conveyor used for moving sand and gravel. Heavy loads have to be accelerated. Since the load on the motor is heavy, heavy load should accelerate for the motor. Next, due to presence of grit and dust in atmosphere, totally enclosed type motors are used. So grit means small particles of sand. So due to presence of grit and dust, normally we call dust means powdery substance of earth, we call as a dust. So due to the presence of grit and dust, there is a possibility this will enter into the motor and winding may get destroyed. So totally enclosed type motor will be more useful for this belt conveyor. The next drive will be, so selection of motor for this particular belt conveyor: high torque squirrel cage induction motor, double cage slip ring induction motor. So the AC motor of squirrel cage induction motor having 2 cages, double cage induction motor will have slightly higher starting torque. These are very much useful for belt conveyor. Quarrying. So quarrying means extracting stone from the ground. It is just like mines, stone will be extracted from the earth. So for this quarrying we are using totally enclosed surface cooled type used to avoid excessive dirt in the atmosphere. So totally enclosed and surface cooled motor is more useful for quarrying because a lot of stone dust will be there. Next, robust construction and grit does not enter and spoil the winding. The motor is of robust construction, it means very strong in construction, and grit does not enter. Grit means small particles of sand. So grit should not enter, otherwise the winding of the motor will get spoiled. High starting torque squirrel cage induction motor is very much useful for quarrying purpose. Refrigeration and air conditioning. Refrigeration means to reduce the temperature so that we get the cooling purpose. We are using domestic refrigerators, and air conditioning also normally we are employing in industries. So the air conditioning is the process of controlling the humidity and air velocity from the atmosphere. That means during winter season we get just heating effect because of air conditioning, and during summer season we get the cooling effect. It is very important drive, normally used for office buildings and industries. The starting torque of motor is 200 to 250% of full load torque. The minimum torque needed for the motor is 200 to 250%. Selection of motor: small unit single phase capacitor type induction motor can be employed. For larger refrigeration and air conditioning unit, 3-phase squirrel cage induction motor or slip ring induction motor. These are all AC motors widely employed in industries. If it is very large unit, synchronous motor can be used for this particular drive. Here I have shown the diagram for the synchronous motor. You have the exciter and slip rings will be provided, contains stator and rotor. So this is most widely used for refrigeration and air conditioning for larger units only. The next will be the paper mills, that is manufacturing of the paper. It may be thin or it may be thicker, varieties of paper we are using. For that, the raw material will be grass, wood and waste paper. These are converted into pulp by chemical process. So the raw material used for the paper mills are grass, wood and waste paper. All these raw material will be converted into pulp. Pulp means it is a mass with wet condition. Mass with wet condition is called as a pulp. Water removed from pulp, pressed into sheets of paper, wound on mandrel after passing through wire pressing, dryer, calendar and reel section. So from the pulp they will remove the water content and then that pulp will process through different sections, that is wire section, and then you have the pressing section. It is pressed into small sheets and dryer. Entire moisture can be eliminated in the drying section, and calendar section and reel section. So in the reel section it is wound into number of reels over a mandrel. So that means calendar section, the color also can be done in the calendar section. So after passing through all these sections, paper will be pressed into sheets and it is wound on a shaft called mandrel. Selection of motor: AC squirrel cage or slip ring induction motor and DC motor with Ward-Leonard system of speed control. So these two motors are very much useful for paper mills. The next drive will be textile mills. For textile mills means manufacturing of cloth. The raw material is cotton that is available from the fields and reaches the textile mills. So there are three important processes in the textile mill: ginning, blowing and carding. So ginning means removing seeds from the raw cotton. It is called ginning. Next, after removing the seeds, the ginned cotton is taken to a blowing room. In that room, number of blowers will be arranged. So entire cleaning process can be done in a blowing room. Carding: the cleaned cotton is converted into laps by lap machine. So normally the laps are nothing but small strips or rectangular pieces, that is by means of lap machines entire cleaned cotton is converted into laps, and finally the laps are converted into slivers by means of carding. Slivers also comes under small strips of cleaned cotton, they are called as slivers. Looms are used to convert yarn to cloth. So the loom motors employed for looms. Yarn means that is spun cotton. The spun cotton finally is converted into cloth. Selection of motor: 3-phase squirrel cage induction motor and 3-phase slip ring induction motor used for spinning machines. Steel rolling mills, that is manufacturing of steel pipes or steel thread or steel tubes. In a rolling mill, the billet has to be processed. Billet means a small bar of metal that should be rolled or processed in the mill. Hot ingots from soak pits are rolled in the mills. Hot ingots means the mass of the metal, that hot mass of the metal extracted from soak pits are finally rolled in the mill. The ingots, after passing through several tables, reach the main mill stand. So ingot means the hot mass of metal reaches or passes through several tables. You have the approach table, intermediate table and front table, and finally it reaches the spear table. When the steel comes to spear table, it is cut into different shapes and sizes. So the finished steel is cut in a spear table to standard sizes. Again, steel rolling mills are hot rolled type and cold rolled type. Two methods are employed. Selection of motor for steel rolling mills. DC motor with Ward-Leonard speed control can be employed. Thyristor controlled induction and synchronous motor can be employed, because by employing the thyristors or silicon controlled rectifiers, the speed control is very smooth and very fast. So that type of thyristor control is very much useful for steel rolling mills. The next drive will be ship propulsion, that is movement of a ship. The motor drives the propeller shaft. Propeller means it is a big wheel containing blades. The propeller is used for movement of a ship. Ships use steam turbine or diesel electric generation supplies to motor. Steam turbines in earlier days we are using for ship propulsion. Nowadays we are using diesel electric generation. Diesel engine coupled to a generator, and output of generator can be fed to a motor, that is diesel electric generation can be used. Big ships and battleships. Turbo alternators feed three-phase synchronous motor or induction motor. So big ships and battleships employ turbo alternators. The output three-phase supply can be fed to the three-phase induction motors. Cargo ships. Cargo means transportation of goods from one place to another place. We are using the ships. They are called cargo ships. Diesel engine drives DC generator, supplies power to DC motor. So diesel engine is coupled to DC generator and it is connected to a DC motor. Mines. Motor divided into two groups for mines. Mine auxiliaries, that is pumps and compressors are used. So that is the motors used for small pumps and compressor comes under mine auxiliaries. So today we discussed about the various drives normally used in different industries, and every industry will contain all these drives. So all the important drives have been covered in this particular session.